Welcome to the 700 Club. 4,000, that's how many rockets Hamas and Islamic Jihad launched at Israel from Gaza. So where did they get the rockets? You guessed it, from the mother of all terrorist nations, Iran. And now the jihadist leaders are bragging about it. So will this incriminating evidence affect the president's nuclear talks with the Islamic regime? Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told Secretary of State Blinken he hoped the U.S. will not renew the nuclear deal with Iran, and that if necessary, Israel will chart its own course.
We also reiterated that whatever happens, Israel will always reserve the right to defend itself against a regime committed to our destruction, committed to getting the weapons of mass destruction for that end.
Blinken came with a message to rebuild Gaza.
The United States will work to rally international support around that effort while also making our own significant contributions, including some that I'll announce later today. We'll work with our partners closely with all to ensure that Hamas does not benefit.
For many, it's an open question to see how U.S. and international aid can rebuild Gaza without benefiting Hamas. After the conflict, Hamas's leader gave much of the credit to Iran.
And I cannot but thank those who brought forth money and weaponry to the valiant resistance, the Islamic Republic of Iran, who did not hold back money, weapons, or technical support.
During the conflict, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu displayed an Iranian drone intercepted on the Jordanian border.
And that, I think, says everything on the true patron of terror in the Middle East and in the world, Iran.
It's this flagrant support of Hamas and other terror groups in the region that led 44 Republican senators to send a letter to President Biden to suspend its nuclear talks with the Islamic regime. Many, like former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Ron Dermer, are concerned sanctions relief would enable Iran to export its terror throughout the region.
Iran is stirring the pot in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Gaza. That's all of Iran's terror proxies in the region, which is another reason, while this is going on in Gaza, we shouldn't lose sight of who the big enemy is, Iran. I hope very much that the U.S. administration will not go back into the dangerous nuclear deal with Iran, and that will continue to keep the pressure on that Iranian regime that represents a threat to us, it represents a threat to our Arab neighbors, and it represents a threat to peace throughout the region.
Chris joins us from Jerusalem for more on the U.S., Israel, and Iran. Chris, is there any question that Hamas is being funded by Iran?
There's really no question about that, Pat. In 2019, there was a deal between senior Hamas officials and Iran that they would up their support for Hamas from $6 million a month to $30 million a month. And, Pat, much of this money is actually sent in cash on its way into Gaza by Qatar. And that's like $360 million a year. And one thing I've heard, Pat, is that if the U.S. or any European governments or any other governments want to help humanitarian needs inside Gaza, is don't send cash. Hamas needs that cash. That's what they've used to build the tunnels, the rockets. But inside Gaza, it's nearly impossible to monitor that cash. It goes right to Hamas's military, and even though Israel right now is reassessing that policy because they're the ones that actually let Qatar go in with those suitcases of cash month by month. And, Pat, it's really important to remember Hamas inside Gaza is a dictatorship. There's a fiction about freedoms inside Gaza. They took over in 2007. There's been no elections since then. And it really bears repeating that its charter says it plans to obliterate Israel, kill Jews all over the world.
Chris, you know, they talk about a two-state solution. There is, in my opinion, it's an impossibility. I mean, given the current status of the Hamas leadership. Am I right?
Well, I think it's a bit of a fiction, Pat. I remember back in 2004, you spoke at the Herzliya conference, and you talked about this cruel chimera, this idea of land for peace. You know, in 2000, Israel gave up land on its northern border, and that allowed Hamas to fill that vacuum and take over. Now there's maybe 150,000 rockets in Gaza, in southern Lebanon. And then they gave up Gaza back in 2005. You remember the disengagement, and look what happened there. There used to be certain, terror attacks, but nothing to the scale right now. And since then, we've had wars in 2008, 9, 2012, 2014, now 2021. So really, this idea of land for peace or a two-state solution is a bit of a fiction. I'd add, Pat, right now, that recently, Mahmoud Abbas from the Palestinian Authority canceled elections in the West Bank. Why did he do that? Because he knew that Hamas would take over. And if Hamas took over in the West Bank, that would be like Gaza 2.0.
Well, Chris, in this dangerous moment, what is the nightmare scenario for Israel?
Well, the nightmare, Pat, right now for Israel is looking to the north, looking for Hezbollah. The nightmare scenario is a war with Hezbollah. So imagine, Pat, in the last 11 days or during that war, Hamas fired 4,000 rockets in 11 days. But in one day, Hezbollah could fire more than 4,000 rockets in just one day. They have an arsenal of more than 150,000 rockets. The important point, there's not just rockets, they're missiles. And the difference is that missiles are precision guided. They could hit all over Israel. And there is a threat. One expert was telling me just a few minutes ago, it's a threat 10 times bigger than Hamas. And right now, you can imagine Hezbollah and Iran were watching this conflict and learning. And it's important what Prime Minister Netanyahu said earlier today with Secretary Blinken. He said Israel reserves the right to defend itself. So if Israel ever had to attack Iran, that's the trigger for Hezbollah to unleash that arsenal. And Pat, the IDF is saying they will fight back with all their might. They too have been preparing for this war in the north. And so that's the big thing to look forward to coming right now, Pat.
Well, it's a frightening thing, and our prayers are with you. Chris, thanks so much for your insights. Well, in other news, 1 year ago, the murder of George Floyd triggered protests and riots across the country. Still, Congress hasn't passed any police reform. Why not? John Jessup has more on that from our CBN News Bureau. Here's John.
Thanks, Pat. Today marks the one-year anniversary of the death of George Floyd, the 46-year-old black man who died at the hands of Minneapolis police, sparking nationwide protests. His death drawing attention to the high number of cases of black men killed by police and calls for police reform. President Biden set a deadline for Memorial Day for passing a federal reform bill, but Republicans and Democrats so far unable to reach an agreement. Floyd's family, including his 7-year-old daughter, Gianna, will meet with President Biden at the White House today. Well, in addition to calls for reform, George Floyd's murder sparked a nationwide movement to defund the police. But communities across the country are facing a surge in violent crime. Just this weekend, there were 12 mass shootings over a 72-hour period. 132 people were killed and hundreds were hurt. In New Jersey, 2 people died and 12 were injured in a shooting at a house party. In South Carolina, a 14-year-old girl was killed and 14 others were hurt at an outdoor concert. And near Santa Ana, California, a 6-year-old was gunned down in a possible road rage incident. The White House calling it a gun problem.
Is there a crime problem in this country?
Well, I would say certainly there is a guns problem, and that's something the president would say. And there are communities where local violence and community violence is an issue.
There has also been an increase in hate crimes across the United States, most recently attacks on Asian Americans and Jews. Los Angeles Rabbi Abraham Cooper of the Simon Wiesenthal Center told CBN News one reason for these attacks is due to cuts in police forces.
Now, if you don't have properly trained police and fully funded police, and they're not around to deal with the behavior, you see very quickly the escalating lawlessness and violence. And that's one of the reasons why we're particularly on edge, because of what's going on today in U.S. cities.
Last year, Los Angeles cut $150 million from its force. Now it is increasing the budget to hire 250 more officers. Pat, back to you.
It was just a question of insanity. You know, defund the police. Portland wanted to defund the police. Chicago, defund the police. Police officers have given their lives, and they're resigning in droves. And so there aren't enough police officers. And you cannot expect a law-abiding constituency without some kind of restraint, because the animal nature in human beings is to have violence. And it's not a, quote, gun problem. It's a people violent problem. And unless you have a restraining influence, you will have the people run amok. And it's insanity in these Democrat-run communities. They have cut the police budget, and thousands, thousands of police officers are resigning from the force. And, you know, it's amazing. In Portland, they wanted to take away all the police budget. Now they're begging to get some of them back. Chicago, the same thing. They don't want the word out, but it's happening. John?
Well, Pat, in other news, Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill punishing social media platforms that remove political or controversial ideas from their websites. DeSantis blamed big tech for blocking debate over COVID-19 policies and the origins of the virus. The bill allows the state to fine large social media companies for removing a state or local candidate's account. Private citizens can also sue if they feel the companies block their opinions. Democrats opposed the measure, and Pat, even critics of big tech say the newly signed bill is unconstitutional.
I couldn't comment on that, but I applaud DeSantis. He's becoming a hero of the Republican Party, and it seems to me that he will be the likely candidate of the Republicans coming up in the general election. But we'll see how that works out. But people have said a DeSantis-Tim Scott ticket would be a real winner, because from what I can see, the Democrats really don't have a leader. You know, the governors of California and New York have been having terrible problems. And who is emerging to lead the Democrat Party? I don't see one. But it does seem that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will hardly be around to lead anything.